This morning we're continuing our series, Generation to Generation. And our text this morning is Psalm 78. Psalm 78 if you want to turn there. Now, if you turn to Psalm 78, it's a very, very long psalm. I think it might be the second longest following Psalm 119. And we're not going to look at the whole psalm this morning, though we're going to be considering the whole psalm. And we're going to focus on the first 8 verses which capture the big idea for the psalm. And we're going to begin by reading. Give ear to the word of God. Listen, O my people, to my instruction. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth, and I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not conceal them from their children, but tell them to the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wondrous works that he has done. For he has established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should teach them to their children, that the generations to come might know, and even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. Psalm 78 is known as a didactic historical psalm. And basically that means that Psalm 78 is a piece of Israelite liturgy aimed at teaching and instructing the people, helping them to remember the story and the story of the people. Now, any reading of the psalm will show that it's not just a history lesson. The psalm is not just intended to give a list of facts. Rather, the point of remembering the history of God's people is because remembering what God has done in the past has implications for how one is to live and act in the present. And the first 8 verses of the psalm kind of function as the preamble to the psalm, telling us what the function and purpose of the psalm is. And the rest of the psalm recounts the history of Israel from Genesis to David. Of course, now you've heard the first 8 verses. You might be thinking, well, Wayne, this is what you taught on last week. This idea of the old teaching the young. This is exactly what verse 5 says, that their fathers should teach their children. And while we're going to be looking at that same idea this morning, the old teach the young, the content is different. And so you aren't getting off that easy with a quick sermon. Last week he talked about the importance of the old teaching the young, the elders in faith passing on the story of God and his wondrous works, telling the truths and wisdoms about God to the next generation. And we saw that it's important for the church and the community of believers to live in an intergenerational community, to live with all ages present and interacting with each other, because this is one of the primary ways faith is formed. As the quote we've been looking at states, the best way to be formed in faith is to sit among the elders, listen to their stories, break bread with them, drink from the same cup, observing how these early generations of saints ran the race, fought the fight, and survived in grace. The old must teach the young the faith. They must pass on the wisdom and truth about God they know. And if the old failed to do this, if the young failed to listen to learn from the older generations, then this is where sin enters in. Throughout the Bible, the beginning of sin is to forget the works of God, to forget the gracious action of God on behalf of his people in the past. So the old have this duty, the elders in faith have the duty to teach the young, to pass on truths about God. Thus we saw with the Passover, the point of the Jewish festivals and Passover especially was to provide those teaching moments, those learning opportunities where the old and young can dwell together and the old can pass on the story and the heritage of faith. And again, at first glance, this might seem like what Psalm 78 is doing, but the content, while the idea is the same of how they go about teaching is the same, the old teaching the young is the same, the content is different. And to get at that, I had to ask a question. How many of y'all are Star Wars fans? Really? Not that many? Okay, well, this may not land as well then. How many of y'all have seen The Last Jedi, those that are Star Wars fans, one of the newer films? Okay, still very few. For those that have seen it, how many of y'all liked it? Y'all actually liked it? Okay. So I actually have to admit, I hated this film. I hated it. Hated the themes, hated the character art, thought it ruined Star Wars. I'm one of that crowd. But there's one fantastic scene in the film that I think somewhat redeems the film in my eyes, and we should be able to find good in what we don't like. Since so many of y'all haven't seen it, just a quick recap of Star Wars. they're basically, you have the good guys, they're known as the Jedi. Think warrior monks. And you got the bad guys known as the Sith, think space Nazis. And you have these Jedi, and they're this ancient order of peacekeepers throughout the galaxy. And Jedi have new recruits. They go through a long series of training to become these peacekeepers. And the Jedi Order had actually been destroyed, but Luke Skywalker, the hero of the previous films, had restarted it. But as he was training a new generation of Jedi, they all turned to the dark side. His new recruits went bad. And Luke, because of this failure, is now this washed-up leader living as a hermit. He's refusing to teach anything he knows. He's refusing to pass on and train a new generation of Jedi. He thinks it's time for the Jedi to end. And so he's this washed-up leader living as a hermit, afraid of his failures. But then he has another Jedi named Master Yoda appears to him as a ghost. And even if you're not a Star Wars fan, unless you've been living under a rock, I'm sure you've seen the Baby Yoda memes that have been going around. He's cute. This is actually not Yoda, but that's another story. But old Yoda appears to Luke and tells Luke this. He said, "Heeded my words, not did you." And also, for those that aren't Star Wars fan, Yoda has this odd way of switching words around, so you have to deal with that. But heeded my words, not did you. Pass on what you have learned. Strength, mastery, yes. But weakness, folly, failure also. Yes, failure most of all. The greatest teacher failure is. Luke, we are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters. The wise words of Yoda, the old not only have the duty to pass on strength and mastery, to pass on the wisdom they know, to pass on those times they were strong in faith. But the elders in faith must also teach their failures, confess their mistakes and follies. For unless the old teach the young their mistakes, unless they tell of their failures, the young are doomed to repeat them. Pass on what you have learned, strength and mastery, yes, but weakness, folly, failure also. Yes, failure most of all. These words of Yoda are the wisdom of Psalm 78, teaching our failures. Teaching our failures. The older generations teaching the younger generations their failures, their mistakes of their past. This is what happens over and over again throughout Psalm 78. We're going to look at a couple of examples. Look down at verse 14 if you want to follow along. It says, "He who divided the sea and caused them to pass through it, and he made the water stand up like a heap. Then he led them with the cloud by day and by night with the light of fire. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundant drink like ocean depths. He brought forth streams also from the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. Yet still they continue to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert." Another example, look down at 54, verse 54. "He brought them to the land, to his holy land, to this hill country which his right hand had gained. He also drove out the nations before them and appointed them as an inheritance by measurement. And he made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents, yet they tempted and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies." Over and over again, if you look throughout the psalm, it recounts the great wonders of God, these gracious acts of God on behalf of his people, only then to go and tell of how the people failed to respond, to tell of their failure to be faithful and keep covenant with God. That's the whole purpose of this psalm. If you look back at the preamble that we read at the beginning, verses 1 through 8, look especially at 6 and 8, and they highlight this purpose. That the generation to come might know even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell their children. They should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its hearts, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. So the wisdom of Psalm 78 is to teach your failures, to tell the next generation of the times you were weak in faith, the mistakes you made in faith. You know, I had this annoying idea in our society that you had to have experience in something in order to be able to speak into it. That you need to have experience in something in order to be able to talk about it. We had the proverb, experience is the best teacher. But in reality, this is an absurd idea. I think it's utterly false idea. Not that there's not a certain wisdom that comes from experience, not that people that have experience in something shouldn't be listened to. But if we follow this idea to its end, to speak to someone who's had a car wreck, I need to go wreck my car. Or to speak to someone who's lost a brother and sister, I need to be plotting my brother's murder currently. If those sound absurd, that's the point. We don't have to have experience in something in order to speak into it. In fact, an ancient proverb reads, "Only the foolish learn from experience, the wise learn from the experience of others." And this is the wisdom of Psalm 78. As Yoda also stated, the goal of any teacher, the goal of any elder in faith is that their students grow beyond them. That the next generation progresses further towards God than we have. Older generations should pass on their mistakes so that the young do not repeat them. Teachers should teach and tell of their failures so that their students can take that knowledge and press on to greater heights. That is the blessing and burden of any teacher. Our goal is to help our students grow beyond us. We teach them our wisdom, yes, but we teach them our failures so they don't repeat them, so they can progress further in the journey towards God. That's the goal of any elder in faith, to pass on the faith, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that the young can start at a higher level. So the next generation is not doomed to repeat them. Or Psalm 78 will put it, so that they may not be like their fathers, not follow in the wickedness of their fathers. So Psalm 78 is this piece of Israelite liturgy aimed at enabling the older generations of faith, the elders in faith, to pass on what they have learned, to pass on the good news of God's gracious acts, but also teach of their failures, so that the older generation can grow beyond them, as Lewis might put it, to go further up and further in the journey towards God. This should be the goal of any teacher, that our students surpass us. The goal of any father should be that our child becomes greater in the faith than we were, that they avoid the failures and the mistakes we made. And this is how we become like Christ together. When the old teach the young both their wisdom and their mistakes. And so the question for us this morning is, what are our mistakes? If we think back on our own lives individually, what are the mistakes? What are our failures in faith? What wisdom do we learn from those mistakes that we can pass on to the next generation? We could also think communally. What are the mistakes of Cross Timbers? What have we learned as a community of faith that we want our children, what are the mistakes we've made that we don't want our children to repeat? How do we pass on and allow our children to learn from our failures? Or we can think about, broadly speaking, our tradition. What are the failures of the churches of Christ? How do we teach future generations of the churches of Christ? How do we teach about our failures so that they don't follow us in them, so that they become more like Christ than we are? Have we told the younger generations about the Church of Christ's failure during the civil rights era, being part of the white moderate? Have we taught the younger generations about our failure of legalism, believing that we can earn our salvation? Have we taught the younger generations about our failure in being schismatics, dividing over trivial issues, our failure of unity? Have we taught the younger generations of our failure to encourage the abilities of women in serving in our assemblies? Now, I point all these out not to be overly critical of the churches of Christ. There is much good in our tradition that we must teach as well. There's much good in our tradition that we need to teach to the broader Christian world. But we have to also own up and confess our failures to one another. That way, future generations may become more like Christ, that we may grow together. Only by confessing our mistakes can the next generation grow beyond us. So this morning, I want to go invite the praise team up. This morning, let's commit to the practice of the people of God, living in intergenerational community with one another where the old may teach the young, providing those teaching moments and opportunities, and let us confess our failures to one another. Ask ourselves the question, what are my failures, what are my mistakes, what are my follies, what do I not want the younger generation to follow me in? And let each generation teach the other. Let's confess our failures to one another this morning as together we stand and sing.